Thank you very much, Victoria. And I just want to reiterate what you just said. If you do have questions, please make sure you send those out. And we, like I said, if this goes too long tonight and we can't take questions tonight, we'll definitely follow up and try to ask, especially if you have organizational specifics that maybe you don't even want to have discussed out loud in the group, and that's fine. We can follow up with you on an individual basis. So again, first thing before we get jumping right in, thank you for taking time out of your evening. We've found out we've tried evening webinars a few times and we've had great success. It seems that, especially when it comes to board issues and board members, many of you have daytime jobs. So carving out an hour of your time in your workday is not always convenient or even feasible. So we tried this evening one. The numbers even tonight show that it's a hit time. So thank you for taking time out of your personal time in the evening to try to know and learn and grow how to be a better board member, or what it means to be a board member. So our objectives this evening is to try to help you understand the legal duties of board members and the various roles that you'll take on as a board member. So today's nonprofit board, the first thing I want to say for all of you that are on the webinar this evening is thank you for serving. I don't know if people tell you that often enough, but obviously at Grow and Lead, we think the nonprofit community is a vital piece of our communities and serving the needs, especially filling in the gaps where maybe government or other entities are not being able to meet the needs, and nonprofits fills those gaps. So thank you for volunteering your time and serving on whatever nonprofit that you're serving on. So we'll start off with the very first thing about a nonprofit board is that it is by far, it is the most important part of a nonprofit. Believe it or not, it's not a great staff or a great executive director. A healthy, well-functioning, well-informed board is by far the most important key piece to a nonprofit. And from our experience, a really strong board means a strong organization. So you could have the greatest superstar in the world as your director or your staff members, but without great guidance and leadership and oversight from a board, they'll never fly to the heights they can. So just to start off, a stress one thing is that you are a body, and I put that on there kind of as an important thing, is that, in other words, you're an entity that acts as one to make legally and socially responsible decisions. So so you're legally responsible to be stewards of the resources of the organization you're serving, and to make sure that it is following its mission, its stated mission. So yeah, again, a board is responsible for defining the organization's mission and providing overall leadership, strategic direction to the organization. In other words, the executive director, you work with them in hopefully in good unison and cooperation to help guide the direction of the organization. But really, as the hiring body of your executive director, you really do set the course and set the direction. An executive director is meant to fulfill and carry out those directives. So if you're looking and leaning too much on your executive director to make all the decisions, you'll see how that's important that you step up and do that. So because again, you're responsible for hiring that executive director, giving that person, that's you as the board are the only person that gives them oversight. There's no other person above them. So you need to give them direction, oversight, and you're also responsible for evaluating their performance. So the highest purpose is obviously, if you're on your nonprofit was set up and formed for a reason, for some kind of act of good, and typically it's for the good of others. So whether you're an advocate for the environment, for children, for our history, for physical fitness, whatever your specialty is, the community is expecting you to fulfill that mission and carry out that mission. And so you're acting in the good of the community and the mission of which you're signing up for when you become a board member. So So also boards have the responsibility of evaluating your own effectiveness as governing bodies and making sure you're upholding the public interest that you're serving as an organization. All right, that's a long intro. Let's get down to the legal duties that are required for a board. And the first one we list is the duty of care. And this describes the level of competence that is expected of someone serving as a board member of a nonprofit. So it really is kind of like not common sense, but it's like the idea that something that's an ordinarily prudent person would exercise, the judgment they would exercise in a similar circumstance and in a similar position. So you're exercising reasonable care when it comes to making decisions as a steward of the organization. So, and to do that, you have to be competent, you have to be diligent. So in other words, you have to be well informed to be able to make good decisions that a normal everyday person would say, yeah, that makes sense. But if you're not, if you're uninformed, if you don't keep up on what's happening in your organization and aware of the decisions being made and being actively involved in that, then you're slipping in that duty of care. So some other ways, regular attendance is very important. Paying attention while you're in a board meeting. People love to multitask these days. If your board doesn't have a policy about shutting off your electronic devices when the board meeting starts, maybe you should actually set that down as a guideline for a best practice so that your attention is where it needs to be. Another example of duty of care is reading the materials. So reading the notes from the previous the minutes from the previous meeting, being read up on what's going to be presented that evening, so that when that moment in the board meeting comes where decisions are made and discussions need to be happened, you're not right then and there reading something for the first time. It's something you've come prepared to have discussion and then hopefully render a decision that's in the best interest of the organization. So if your board currently does not send out the previous months, or whenever you meet, could be quarterly, minutes prior to your next meeting, you probably should do that. And again, if the executive director or a board member is presenting materials that they want discussed at a meeting, those should also be sent out ahead of time so that everyone has a chance to review those and be familiar with what's going to be discussed or talked about. So they'll have relevant questions and discussion points and be able to interact with the decision about to be made and not trying to play catch up. These are things that often make our board meetings longer than they need to be, or gets us down rabbit holes when it starts to go, well, give me a second while I read this. And that's just not best use of your time. And it does not show that you're taking the concern for the issues at hand. So another thing when you're talking about duty of care is what I just said, is being prepared, or just in general, asking questions. If you're unsure of something that is being decided or discussed in a board meeting, the worst thing you can do as a person who is one of a body that is set aside to make decisions on behalf of this organization is to hear something you don't understand and sit back and do nothing. We could tell you stories, I could tell you stories of a lot of organizations, several across the UP, that really got themselves in a whole heap of trouble because board members would not ask the tough questions, would not ask for clarifications, and just essentially rubber stamp things for their director to just like, oh, okay, good, and trusted that person just almost blindly, I should say that. And then when things go sideways, they go, wait, what happened? How did that happen? Not realizing that their lack of asking solid questions and making sure they're engaged was led to part of those things slipping through and slipping beyond their awareness. So I serve on a board, and that happened once where I was brand new to the board. Something was brought up and people were kind of having a little casual conversation about it, like, oh, okay, we might possibly do that. And me working in this capacity saw a really potential to really drag down our staff and put too much on their plate, and kind of like almost like that slippery slope. If we do this, then it could lead to more stuff like this in the future. So I finally got up the courage, raised my hand, said, I don't think we want to be doing that. And sure enough, two other members of the board, one an accountant, one a lawyer, immediately jumped up and said, oh, I agree with him. He's absolutely right. Here's the reasons why. And they listed all these reasons why we should engage in that. And I'm like, okay, guys, why didn't someone else step up? But again, it took me raising the flag and saying, I'm not sure we want to go in this direction, before a couple other board members also jumped on board. So if you're unsure, ask questions. I don't think, hopefully your board doesn't have the environment where asking questions is frowned upon, because that's the reason why you're there. And if you don't understand something, ask. Here's another one's a classic one. People are afraid to ask about the finances. If they don't understand or unaware of how that is or what it means, they're like, oh my gosh, everyone else seems like they know what everything else means, so I'm just not going to ask. You'd be shocked when the first board member asks, can someone explain me exactly what this balance sheet means and what am I supposed to be looking for? How many other board members probably go, oh yeah, me too. But everyone's afraid, thinking everyone has it all together. And sometimes there's just kind of this groupthink that happens that no one's asking the question. So be diligent. Be on top of things. The real key is that you want all your board members to be active, informed, and making independent decisions. In other words, you're making them collectively as a body, but your vote is an independent, again, duty of care to make sure it's the most, the wisest and best decision you can make given the circumstances and the information you're given. All right, I think I've hammered that one enough. Let's go on to the duty of loyalty. And this is the standard of faithfulness to your organization that a board member must give an undivided allegiance when making decisions affecting the organization. So in other words, decisions you're making, you can never use them for personal gain, and you should always be acting in the best interest of the organization. If you want to kill public opinion and public faith in your organization, just go ahead and start making decisions that you benefit from as a board member. Whether it's the business you work for or whatever, because people will see that immediately and go, whoa, wait a second, they're giving preference to things that benefit their different board members. That erodes public trust very fast. So sometimes there are situations, especially in the nature of doing business, nonprofits still have to seek services and seek help on different projects outside their own organization. And you run into that situation where, okay, whoops, what do we do with this? I'll give an great example. And I've shared this one before if you've heard any of my webinars, is that I serve on a chamber of commerce locally, and we're holding an annual event that calls for a larger room that can hold a bunch of people, like for a dinner. And because we're a certain subsection of the county, we wanted to remain in our area, obviously giving back to our member organizations for the Chamber of Commerce. And there was very limited, there's like 2 places that work for that kind of event. And we had been to the other one place many years in a row, and kind of the feeling was we want to try the other one. Well, it just so happens the other venue, the person who manages it is on our board. And so the simple way of handling that potential conflict is when we went about to vote on where we're going to hold our dinner this year, she just recused herself from that discussion and that vote, thus not influencing anything to go her way that obviously would look good for her business that she helps manage. So that's the best way to get around it. There's a conflict of interest. We all saw it. We all knew it. And so she just graciously said, all right, I won't be voting or discussing this because it has to do with my place of business. So there are ways to handle those things without, and then we noted it in our minutes, why we made the decision and how the decision was made, so that if anyone ever comes back and says, oh, you're just giving favoritism to this person because they serve on your board, we can show them, no, we have a history of actually going to the other place and we wanted to make a change or whatever. And I don't know if this is a consequence, but we've actually now used both places off and on. So, but I think it's good. It's good. It's good to show why that decision was a good business sense for your organization, and it's good for that person who has the potential conflict of interest to just remove themselves from that situation. I think that's a great practice, and it saves you from a lot of headaches of trying to explain yourself, especially if you can point back to your minutes and show why the decision was made. Sometimes there's some boards, and I would suggest this actually, when you sign up, if there's not a conflict of interest policy in place that you have to sign, usually it's almost annually, I would suggest getting that. That just helps with any ambiguity or any confusion of what it means. Usually it outlines what potential conflicts of interest, or you can actually write down as a board member where you see where potential conflicts could arise. And then it's just like when it does get to that area, again, a discussion's had so that you could remove yourself from that decision making. So, all right, I think the hold information in confidence is the idea that a lot of our meetings are public for board members, but that does not mean everything needs to be shared publicly. And sometimes there are issues that there's a need for closed session meetings. And so the idea that when something needs to be held in confidence, that you're not just going around and sharing everything from the organization to anybody. Again, that goes back to duty of care. Is that reasonable? And so does sharing all that information really make sense? Or is it necessary? So be careful with what you share what you need to share. But again, if there's items you don't need to, then it doesn't need to leave the boardroom and that decision-making body. Okay, on to the duty of obedience. So this is the part where I think is extremely important, because you need to be faithful to the organization's mission. So you need to make sure the organization is acting in a way that is consistent with the central goals of the organization. Again, I'll go back to that word public trust. The public trusts that when this organization will manage the funds that are donated to it to fulfill the organization's missions. So this is really important, especially if you gather independent donations or business donations. They want to know that if you said we're doing this, that when they give the money, it's going towards that, and not off on some pet project that's just outside of the mission of what you're doing. And any kind of program that an organization starts should really be looked at through the lens of, is it really following our mission? And if it's not, or if it's shying too far away from that central mission, then it probably should be avoided and not use the resources of the organization to do that. Because again, if the public is looking at it and saying, man, I don't even understand, that seems to have nothing to do with what they're supposed to do, that erodes that trust, and they don't believe, and then that'll hurt your donations if you're not really actively doing what your mission says. And sometimes there are tweaks and changes in the missions. Organizations evolve over time, but those need to be actively communicated then when you're going in a different direction. But again, it's the board's job to make sure that the organization is heading in the way that's of their currently stated mission and not deviating from that course. Also, the board is responsible for making sure that they follow the organization's internal rules, which include your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, any tax exempt filings, their own created policies and procedures. And there's also various laws and regulations that apply to nonprofits on both the state and the federal level. So yes, scary thought for a lot of board members out there is you need to have a handle on these things. You need to have someone who is actively bringing up the latest state and federal regulations to make sure your organization is compliant. If the bylaws are outdated in your organization, you need to have a group from your board come up with suggestions to amend those bylaws. So it's work. It's really work, but these are important, vitally. So now hopefully you can see what I mean when I'm saying that you are the most important piece and body in this whole organization, because keeping them legal is really a part of your job to make sure they're following the rules. Okay, one thing I want to bring up that's really kind of different, that's just popped up in recent time, one of my coworkers brought it to my attention, so I just did a bunch of digging into it, was the question of, and this talks about kind of a little bit of a bunch of these things when it comes to the legal duties of a board member is voting issues. Now, I think most of you are familiar. You get in the meeting and someone brings up a proposal and there's all in favor, say aye, those opposed say nay, whatever, however manner you do that. Pretty clear cut and straightforward. But with the introduction and the very common uses of electronic messaging and information, it opened up a whole new way of potentially making decisions for a board, and there's vast confusion. So I dug into it. I went right to, as far as, hopefully most of you are either from the state of Michigan or Wisconsin. Since we're based in Michigan, I went to the state of Michigan's website to find the answer to this question. If you are from Wisconsin, I apologize, but I'd be more than willing to dig in and find the answer there too. So essentially the deal is voting on issues via email. Is it appropriate or legal? And here's what the state of Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs stated, that it can be allowed and legal to do so. So the vote via email, but there's a big but. There has to be an amendment to your articles or bylaws stating that electronic messaging is permitted for voting purposes of the board. So in other words, if you've been engaging in email voting this whole time and it is not expressly stated in your bylaws, you need to get on that right away. Because someone could come back if they see votes happening that way and go, wait a second, this is not even approved by your own bylaws. So another sub point they mentioned is all possible diligence is expected to ensure that the board member is the actual person submitting the vote and not someone else using their device or email address. Now that's a tough one. How do you know that for sure? That's something you can wrestle with as an organization to make sure that there's a designated email or whatever. And yeah, it gets tricky when we're talking about off-site kind of voting. However, here's something to really be aware of when it comes to email voting. Since that form of communication is not ideal and sometimes prohibitive for discussion or questions and additional comments, it is a best practice if the vote is unanimous with a simple yes, just yes in the email vote for the measure to pass, because the addition of any other comments or clarifications now brings into the point that, wait, there needs to be discussion on this. So you see, so it's not a clear cut. In fact, that vote, that yes vote with clarification on it or additional statements could be considered as a yes, but. And again, if you want to keep it clean, you want to keep it best practice, that's not how you want to do it. So if anyone has additional comments or additional clarifications to their yes vote, that the best case scenario is to table that discussion until the next in-person meeting so that the appropriate discussion and questioning can happen in person with the adequate space and time provided to get the answers they need, so it can be a clear cut. If you think about it, even when we vote yay or nay in our board meetings, there's no one that says yay, but, right? It's either yay and all opposed nay. And so again, if you're voting via electronic means, make sure it's clear cut so that no one can come back and question the validity of your votes. And again, if it ends up being something funky or some questions or concerns, table it, bring it up at the next in-person meeting. Hopefully that helps. It's a rather new thing we threw in this time because it's been brought up a couple different times in questions. So that's right on the State of Michigan website. It's easy to find when you dig into it. Just ask about nonprofits, and email voting, I think, is something, the keywords I kicked in there. So it brought up the different amendment that the Lara group had. So, okay. Whew. All right, let's get on to the work of the board. This is the other part. So if we talked about the legal duties, now we're going to talk about the different roles that you play in some of your work that you do. So these 5 different areas we have gleaned from a bunch of national groups, including Board Connect, Board Source, where these leading groups that really kind of help nonprofit boards and stuff. So we're going to go through them. And as we go through them more in depth individually, I really want you to be thinking about what are area strengths for your board and which of these areas might you need some improvement and work on them. Okay, so we'll start off with board operations. All right, the board operations is, it is your responsibility to recruit, orient new board members, and assess your own performance. Okay, I have heard countless times over the last few years of boards turning to their executive director and say, okay, well, we have 2 spots open, I'll find us board members. If you've dabbled in that practice, I beg you, please stop. It is not your executive director's responsibility to find replacement board members. It's the board's job to find their replacements, to go out and recruit, to have a plan on who you're going to actually approach in your recruiting so that the composition of the board is of the best it can possibly be, whether it's diversity or skill sets or whatever it might be. That's actually the responsibility of the board itself, to figure out who's going to replace us and to know the term limits and when they're up and how to be preparing for that. If you don't have a subcommittee that works with nominating or board development, that might be something to consider. Remember, when talking about subcommittees, everyone thinks, wow, it's just an extra meeting for more board members. A subcommittee needs to have a board member involved, absolutely, but they can fill out a subcommittee with other people outside of the organization's concerned stakeholders or whatever that have an interest in that area, to get more. It's a great way to get more volunteers involved in the organization, and also people who serve on committees are a great kind of grooming ground for later potential board members, especially the more they know about your organization. So, but again, when it comes to recruiting, finding new board members and voting on them, of course, is your job as the board. The second line here talks about the orientation, training, and assessment. Again, I heard this just today working with an organization, that they had new board members and the new board member said, so who's going to help me going through this manual and give me a little bit of a training and orientation to your organization? And they all pointed to the executive director. Wrong answer. They have enough business to do running your organization. The board takes care of the board. So you need to come up with an orientation plan. You need to have someone serve alongside as a mentor or just a peer person to walk alongside and make sure that person understands what their roles and responsibilities are. That's the work and function of a board member, not your executive director. And likewise, if you haven't been doing this, you really need to have an annual assessment of how you're operating as a board, so you can measure yourself up against best practices or even your own expectations and say, how are we doing? So you self-assess yourself. Sometimes if you're really concerned or you're super proactive, which is really the positive things, you would get an outside consultant to come in and assess your board and how it operates and functions. So the last part of board operations is the structure of the board, and that just means, the people serving on it. That's selecting your officers for your board, so your executive committee essentially. Again, and that's the board's responsibility to choose their own executives. So typically those your chairperson, vice chair, treasurer, and secretary. So again, a part of the board needs to be on top of. All right, so the very next item we'll touch on is strategic planning. And a little bit about this is, again, it's the board's responsibility to determine the organization's missions, goals, and its very purpose. So again, if you're leaning too much on your executive director, you need to be cautious of that, because the executive director is looking for marching orders to go and do and get things done. But the keeping true to the mission and pointing to the direction from a bird's eye view, that 10,000 foot jetliner view, that's the board's job. So to make sure that all the different activities that go on in day to day are still fulfilling these big overarching goals and purpose to the organization. So the board is always thinking and planning for the future. They're always looking forward, and staying true to your mission. So the board should be partnering with the executive director to drive forward the mission of the organization, but it shouldn't be the ED, the executive director, telling the board what direction the organization is going to go. That's a little backwards. Now, will they have a say in it? Like the executive director saying, here's where I see it going. That's fine. They can give input, but they shouldn't be just the board blindly going, oh yeah, okay, sure, that, whatever you say. That's not acting with that duty of care, or that duty of loyalty, or excuse me, not loyalty. It was, man, I'm getting all combobulated. The obedience one, obedience to your mission. So be aware of that. Don't push too much on. Don't let your executive director just run the show. It's your responsibility to keep the organization on task. So, all right. Let's see. The next one's resource development. And resource development means the board is responsible for ensuring the organization has the needed resources to meet the mission. Okay, now let me make sure I explain the 3 different pieces of resource development. And Vic, I promised I wouldn't do this, but if you want to forward a couple slides, you'll get down to my little subsets you'll see in this. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
So there's 3, that's quite okay. It's all right. There are subsections that, there's 3 different resources you really need to be aware of and helping make decisions on is the financial, the human resource, and the physical. Well, let's just start with the middle one first. The biggest human resource that you're dealing with is, yes, you're concerned with and make sure you want to see oversight to make sure there's no egregious things happening from a director's level, an executive director level, is like abusing your staff. I mean, obviously you want to make sure you're aware and have at least enough knowledge to be able to see those signs if they pop up. But the biggest thing is the human resource you're really looking out for is hiring that executive director and then making sure that person has what they need to fulfill the job that you're giving them to do. That's a really big one. In other words, making sure they're not overworked. We all know executive directors put in way too many hours. It's a chronic problem across the board. But it's the board's job to make sure that they're kind of in some ways protecting or again partnering with the executive director to make sure that they're staffed correctly, that the executive director is not overwhelmed or in over their head. And part of that is the financial part. Yes, I know. We're going to talk about this more in a little bit. Every person I know in the board member, oh, the fundraise. I don't care how you do it. Most nonprofits fundraise. Some write grants. Some do other things, write for other funding in the community or go to sponsors or whatever it is. But that is part of the board's responsibility. If you set a budget, if you agree and vote on a budget, what you are telling your executive directors, we're going to make, with your help, partnering with you, we're going to make sure these resources are there to meet our budget. You're not saying that's all on you. That's not how it works. So be ready to try to dive in and help wherever you can and look for resources. Be on the lookout for resources and be a support to your executive director and don't leave everything at their feet. Because again, if you say yes to the budget, you're telling the world and your community that we're going to meet these things so we can meet these needs and get these things done to fulfill our mission. And the last one is physical, and that usually means if you have any sort of physical facilities or equipment or whatever, you're making sure that those are still functioning. Again, that the staff and especially your executive director has the tools to do the job. So that's kind of what that means. All right. The next one, and this is I've been touching on this quite a bit, is the oversight. You provide financial oversight. You are also ensuring that there's legal and ethical integrity and maintain accountability. You're ensuring there's effective organizational planning. So you kind of can monitor, again, from a big eye view up above, and strengthen the organization's programs and services. So in other words, the questions you'll ask your executive director is not necessarily about the day-to-day activities, but the question you want to ask, again, that bird's eye view is, are they actually accomplishing what they're supposed to be accomplishing? Are these programs having the effect that we thought they would? when we invest in them and put time and effort into them? Or is it just happening and there's no real effect? And then we maybe have to reevaluate if that's the direction you want to go. Or if it seems to be successful, but not really like gaining enough traction, is there any way the board can help that thing succeed? So, but again, when you're talking, again, I have horror stories of boards who have not taken their oversight, especially in the financial areas, sometimes even the legal areas, haven't taken that as serious as it really is, because there is legal responsibilities on the place of a board member when it comes to making sure that the executive director and any financial persons in the organization are actually doing things in an ethical and accountable way. Again, you probably know some yourself in your own community, wherever you're at, is where things have gone sideways and the board goes, whoa, how'd that happen? And my question is, whoa, how did you let that happen? Again, if you're not getting the information to the depth you need it, if you're not getting a financial picture that you think it makes sense and is clear, you have to say something. You have to ask the questions. You can't just sit there and go, oh, well, you know, I'm sure they got it going on. They know what they're doing. That's not irresponsible. So just to review again what an organizational chart looks like, the board, you guys are at the top. The executive directors underneath you, that's your direct hire. And you typically, in most organizations, then the executive director kind of fills out their staff and also works with volunteers or something. So you're responsible for hiring and evaluating your executive director. The executive director is responsible for staff and volunteers. And then you support your director and assess their performance. There's another one. I want to talk about oversight. Are you assessing and evaluating your executive director? So many organizations, way too many organizations. We have executive directors that talk to us that say, no, that's not happening. I talked to one earlier that said, I've been here 2 to 3 years and I've never had an evaluation. Excuse me? You've never had an evaluation. How can a executive director know if they're doing their job and if they're doing it well in the eyes of their boss if there's no evaluation given? Evaluation is not a bad term. In fact, I remember when I first started my job at Grow and Lead, I told my boss flat out, if you don't have this, and they assured me they did, which we do, if you don't have an evaluation, I need to be evaluated. I want to know how I'm doing. I want to know where I stand, because I cannot improve or change anything if I don't know how you feel that I'm doing. So if you're not telling your executive director how they're doing, how can they do anything different? How can they grow? How can they look for ways to challenge themselves and do better at their job if you never tell them how they're doing? So just as a simple warning real quick, board, you can't micromanage and provide effective oversight at the same time. So again, remember your role in this is oversight, not into the nitty-gritty details. You can ask the executive director some ideas just to get context, but really you're looking from the bird's eye view above the organization to make sure it stays on course, and leave a lot of the daily details to your executive director. Okay, this is actually a really timely point too. One of the other important parts of the work of the board is ambassadorship. If you didn't see the slide earlier today, in 2 weeks, Victoria and I will be doing another webinar on being an ambassador for your organization as a board member. So I'll touch on it a little bit, but that one will have a lot more content to it. But essentially, as an ambassador for your organization, you're an advocate for the mission, and you're looking for opportunities to enhance the public standing, the awareness, the understanding of what your organization does and why it's important for the community, individuals, businesses, et cetera, to support the work you do. Yes, you are a cheerleader. Absolutely. There should be no louder cheerleaders for your organization than you as a board member. You should be out there declaring the great work that's happening. And if you don't have stories or can tell examples of the good work you're doing, then you need to ask your executive director to get those from their staff so they can share those stories of why it's important that you exist and what you're doing to accomplish your mission. But be that advocate. Don't be afraid. There are people out there all the time, kind of blaring their own causes. So be a part of that. Make your voice be heard if you truly believe in what that organization's doing. So ambassadorship is another great way when someone, if they term off the board or their term's just done and they take a step down or whatever, a great way to encourage and former board members to stay active with the organization is to continue to be that voice. I know so many times someone stops serving and then they never bring up the organization again. Man, if you're passionate, even when you're not serving on the board, you can still be that voice in the community to advocate for the mission of the organization. So if you haven't tapped into your former board members to kind of be that in whatever their circles of influence are, you maybe want to think about getting them back on board, so to speak, to be that voice in their groups. Okay. So just to kind of review, what is a good board member? So you want to obviously attend your board meetings, but not just attend them, actively participate in your meetings. If you don't have an attendance policy or attendance records in your bylaws, that should be something you might want to consider. In other words, I hear a lot of confusion of, well, this person is rarely showing up. When I ask, well, how often do they show up? Well, I don't know, but it just seems like they're never there. If you're not taking adequate records of their attendance, it's hard to call them to order or call them to task on that. Do you have a policy that says you need to make X amount of meetings? You're required to. So you do have flexibility if you have to miss, because we all have life, and so you miss. But if someone's getting to the point where they're not there more than they're not really helping your organization. They're filling a seat, but they're actually hurting you for making your quorums, and they're not contributing if they're not there. So think about that attendance policy type things. Showing up at special events, big deal. It's a big deal. Now, when you go to them, and we'll talk about this just in the very next step here, when you go to them, you don't have authority as a board member, I'll explain, but just showing up sends a really great message to the community that this event's so important that, yeah, as board members, we're here too, supporting it. One of my biggest things to brag about the Chamber of Commerce that I serve on the board is we have amazing attendance from board members at events. There's one I went to a few months back, and 100%, like every board member was there at the event. That's great. That's something worth bragging about, to say, yes, we come and support these events by showing up, and sometimes volunteering, sometimes not, sometimes just being present. Okay, coming prepared for your board meetings. That's what I mentioned. If you don't already set out the stuff ahead of time, start trying to make that a practice so you can be prepared for the meeting. That'll shorten your meetings. It'll be less frustration about all the discussion and dialogue and stuff. So come prepared. Be thinking strategically. In other words, what attributed to the successful outcome of this event or program? How can we replicate that or use that in other formats? What you're not asking the question is, oh, so how much do we spend on those t-shirts for this race? Let the budget people, let the finance people and the executive director decide if that was too much or whatever. You want to look at the money, of course, but you want to say, was the event overall success? Was the bottom line, did you make money on that fundraiser, et cetera? So you're always looking from this big bird's eye view from above. All right. I already mentioned ambassadorship. Speaking up on legal and ethical concerns, I hit that pretty hard. The idea is you have to speak up. If you do not understand, if something smells fishy, say something. Say something. Don't let your organization fall into the trap that so many do, where they just keep on letting things slide. And they're just like, well, they know what they're doing. They will know what they're doing. No, ask a question. Ask them for clarification if you don't understand. Hopefully no one will ever make you feel stupid for asking a question. If you do, you have a boardroom culture problem, we can help you with a Grow and Lead, give us a call. Anyway, one point I want to make out here, the financial contribution once a year, it's another one of those great tools that your executive director loves to be able to use. If they're out soliciting funds, if you're out soliciting funds or looking for opportunities to get people to jump on board and contribute financially, you know, a great thing to say to them, we have 100% donation participation from our board. Yeah, it's a powerful statement to say. Some organizations even can say we have 100% donation participation from our staff. Those are powerful things. In other words, your board believes so much and your staff believes so much in what you're doing that they're willing to give of their own money and resources to further the mission. So it's a pretty powerful statement. This thing I want to really make sure you understand is that I did not put a dollar amount on that. Some, I've actually heard of a few organizations that do. I just think making a contribution is the important part. So you can say everyone's participating. But some people will be able to give of greater means, some will not. I'll give you an example. On our board, we have a handful of youth, people under 18, that serve as active voting members of our board because we believe in the youth development piece of that. They are asked every year to make a financial contribution, but no one thinks anything of it if one board member who is well established gives hundreds of dollars potentially in their annual gift, and that youth board member gives their $5 or $10 because that's just great. They gave what they can from what they have. So again, it's not necessarily about the dollar amount, it's the fact that they're actually doing it and following through. So definitely help identify potential new people for donors, or if you have a membership. Also, this could also be in here, potential volunteers. You're supposed to be on the lookout to get more people involved. So when it comes to meetings, don't rubber stamp things. I just want to throw that out real quick so it doesn't get lost. Make sure you're actively aware what's going on. And here's some things we hear about sometimes, often actually, as symptoms of, and they're not really actual problems themselves. We hear people complain, oh, they're just not showing up for their meetings. We have a hard time meeting quorum. Oh, my board just doesn't want to fundraise. Oh, these people have been around on the board for the past 20 years. Those are all issues. All of those can be solved and with the stuff we've talked about already. So if people are saying that on your board or from your staff, there's ways to solve that. And you have the ability to get beyond that and set in place some policies and parts of your bylaws that will tackle those things so you don't have to keep complaining about those things in the future. Okay, on the next thing, the 3 hats of roles, role clarity. So we've talked a lot about your governance responsibilities, a ton. That's actually the biggest part we've talked about. You are the ultimate legal and moral authority for your organization. However, I just want to make sure this is stated. We talked at the very, very beginning that you're a body of one. In other words, your only authority at your organization is when you're in the boardroom with a quorum present and you can act and vote and make decisions on behalf of the organization. It's a very formal thing. It's like when we're there, boom, now we have the meeting's called to order. We have a quorum present. Now we can do business. All right. The moment that meeting ends, yes, you're still a board member, but you cannot act individually with the power of the board. You just can't. You can't act and make decisions on your own. You have to act as a unit. So if you have a rogue board member who's out there doing whatever, willy-nilly and making decisions and just having everyone haphazardly say yes to them, that's not proper. It's when you're meeting together as a unit, when there's a quorum present, that's your power. The next part is implementation. So this is your task force, your committees, your subcommittees, whatever they are. Now, when you're a board member serving on a committee, do you have some sort of authority? You do. Well, Chad, you just said I don't unless I'm in the boardroom. But see, when you set up a committee, it's an act of the board, formally presented and discussed and voted on in that board meeting. So you're going to decide and vote on setting up X amount of subcommittees or committees. And then a board person, at least one, will serve on those committees. It can be more than one if needed, but it only has to require at least one board member serve on a committee. And they are given authority for a specific defined area. So in other words, you're on fund development and you're the committee and you are tasked with figuring out and bringing to the attention of the board things to help your fund development or your board development or nominating. They're tasked with really doing a lot of the footwork when it comes to finding potential replacements or potential future board members. And then the committees then report to the board their findings, the work they've done in separate meetings. And then the board, again, in the formal capacity, can vote on those items and say, yes, we take the report from the board development and nominating committee, and we think we are going to offer up so and so as the next time we have a board opening or what have you. So I hope that makes sense in the way that works. So you do have limited authority, but it's for a specific area. The last hat that you probably wear more often than anything else is strictly as a volunteer. It's when you're doing work on behalf of the organization outside the boardroom, maybe even outside your committees, and you're just doing it to help. You show up at an event and you have a certain role you have to do. But then you have to be aware, as my last bullet makes, you have no actual individual authority. There was a fundraiser that one of our clients told us about where the executive director was running around like a chicken with her head cut off, making sure all the details were in place or whatever. And a key volunteer had a really big question but couldn't find the executive director. So a board member walked up and said, well, I'm a member of the board. I can help make the decision. Wrong. Unless they've been given that authority by the executive director to help in that capacity for that event, no, they don't. They don't have any authority as a board member. That's great. That's a title you wear, and the power is when you're in the boardroom. You can't start. Essentially, this volunteer felt harassed and kind of bullied by this board member, but they have no individual authority. They should have found, and eventually the executive director was found and put an end to that really fast. But you can't be bossing people around when you're supposed to be serving in a volunteer role at an event or whatever. So just remember your place. You are vitally important, but on your own, acting as an individual, you can't really boss those people around. All right. Hopefully that doesn't happen a lot. The next slide, I think, is a really great, it's actually one of the slides that we get complimented on the most, when it shows the different divisions of responsibilities between a board and your executive director or CEO, whatever your organization calls that person. And before I kind of read out loud some of these different areas, I want to really point to the very bottom of it. You see, this relationship only works between the board and their executive director they hire if there is mutual trust. The moment that is eroded or disappears, board, you should be looking for an ED or a new ED or executive director. It's time to resign and move on. And I'm being blunt, because you have to have that trust to work and partner together. And if that ever gets to the point where it's totally eroded, no one wins here. It's a total loss, and usually things get really nasty and really bad. So keep that foundation of trust. Board, you need to trust that your EDs following the direction you're mapped out from. And executive directors, you have to really truly believe and trust that your board has your best interest and the organization's best interest in mind. But look at the different levels. I want to show you the difference between the bird's eye view and the day-to-day tasks. Again, the board's looking for end results. The executive director is looking for how are we going to get this done? Like, what's the means to get it done? The questions the board asks, the what, why, how much, and the ED is responsible for, well, how, when, and where are we doing all this stuff? Do you see the difference? The tools they're using, the executive director is looking for strategies, procedures, regulations, assignments. They're documenting everything. And the board's looking at what's the mission, what's the goals, what policies are we setting in our standards. So they're looking at a bigger picture. And decision-making for a board is the vote. The ED comes to the board meetings with their recommendations. Okay, so the board can vote on them. It's not the other way around where they're trying to get the executive director to make all the decisions. They're only there to recommend things for the board to do. So the board is the visionaries, keeping that vision and that mission in focus, whereas your executive director or CEO is looking at implementing all the different strategies to get that, to complete the mission and vision. So also, I want to point out one more time, just to reiterate this again as a whole, that you'll notice that that left side is the board. It's not each board member, it's the board as one entity, not individuals. Just want to point that, restate that again. Okay, so some tips and tricks and ideas on how to help you be the best board you can be is looking at having an effective orientation, the worst thing to do is bring on new board members who take 6 months of meetings to figure out what they're doing because no one ever stopped to tell them or gave them a good orientation about what they're supposed to do in their role. All right, get that all done up front, to have someone walk alongside them so they can bounce ideas off, maybe not for the whole group, but they can go off to the side, that kind of mentor relationship. Sometimes it helps to have your mission typed right at the top of all your agendas for every your meetings, always keeping that in the forefront of the board's mind of here's why we do what we do. And this is what we need to, when we're looking at making decisions, it has to be in light of this. The mission moment I mentioned is the idea that looking for opportunities to tell the story of how the mission is actually being fulfilled. This is a great place for the executive director to bring in stories from the staff. Even more powerful, when a board member brings up a story from some kind of volunteering event that they've been at or whatever, where they see or hear stories from maybe people that have been served about the impact of the organization on their lives. Really powerful. And what that does is it keeps the heart in it. It gets people excited about, man, we are making a difference. So if you have an opportunity and write that in your agenda for someone to share a story, it encourages everyone about the work you're doing, the time you're putting in. You can look at the way you do your meetings. Actually, one of our webinars that's coming up next week is talking about meetings, and you can evaluate how effective your meetings are being run. So check that out next week. And again, you can share this. That's why I love that Victoria records this and gets this out. So if you have someone else who needs to listen to this or needs to go through the slides, take it, use it. We don't hold this close to our chest. We want everyone, every board member we know to see this information, understand it, use it. So, and then looking for areas you can improve, because there's no board I've ever worked with ever yet across the UP that has it all together. Some do some things extremely well, but there's always some area they go, oh shoot, we don't do that so good. So always look for the ideas to identify the areas you can improve. Lastly, here's a bunch of different things, and this is a very, very small list of things that GLCYD Grow and Lead can help you with when it comes to your board. And this is not an exhaustive list. If you are a member of GLCYD, which many of you are, not all of you are, but if you're a member, some of these items can be actually be free to you as a part of your member benefits. So if you're not a member, check us out, drop us an email or give us a call. We can tell you what that takes. If you are a member and one of these things would be helpful, you probably know what your member benefits are, but we can help see which we can help you with if you really want. So lastly, thank you. I'm sorry to Victoria and to everyone else if you shot in questions. I took the full hour. But thank you for your attentiveness and listening. If you did send in questions to Victoria, she will share this not just with me, but with our whole staff, and we will try to get back to you to answer your questions specifically. But if you want to know more about us, check us out on Facebook or our website, which is listed here in the last slide. If you want to contact me directly, cmager@glcyd.org. Feel free to drop me an email. And we're here to serve, and we love serving nonprofits. It's our passion, it's our mission. So hopefully you gained some good knowledge tonight, and thank you very, very much for tuning in. Good night.